And so Vinod Khosla, who is a famous VC, you've probably heard of him, he said recently, I was at a conference with him a couple of years ago, and he said data science is going to do more to change healthcare than all of the other sciences combined. Right now, of course, you have to define data science broadly to include kind of stuff related to genetics, because genetics was really the hot thing. But even if you think about the biome and all this other stuff, the only way that we can possibly understand that is with data science. So that's why we have Francis Kendall, who's coming in from Roche, and Roche, you know, is the firm that owns Genentech, and he is what, digital? What's your title?
It changes, but in charge of digital strategy.
Digital strategies at Roche. Yeah. So welcome, Francis.
Okay, so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we see the new data paradigm and how I believe it's going to totally disrupt what we're doing in pharma and change the whole model for a number of reasons. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background to what Roche is and what my role is, and then go into why I think this is important and maybe some discussion. So I'm happy to take questions as we go along. So I'm in a group called Strategic Innovation, which is a cool name, and it's actually quite cool doing some job. This is Roche. So Roche is made up of Roche Diagnostics and Pharmaceuticals. This is very different to the other big pharma. We have the diagnostics bit. So when we develop a product, we try and develop a partner diagnostic with it so we know it's targeted, which is part of our overall policy of having personalised healthcare, so we know the medicine is going to work in the individual. So that's one difference. Then we're split into early development, product development, commercial, and manufacturing. Another thing about Roche, which is different, at least I've worked at Pfizer and Novartis as well, which is different, is our CEO believes in decentralization and innovation coming from different areas. So for early development, when we merged with Genentech, we kept Genentech's early development separate to the Roche early development. So they're more or less developing in the same molecule way, but there's still two groups there doing that. So that's interesting to have that redundancy in there. And then normally product development, commercial, and manufacturing. Then within product development, and I'll come on to what product development is, we have regulatory, which goes to the regulators, biometrics, which are data science. And that's where I came from. I've spent the last 25 years in biometrics groups, so leading stats, programming stats, data management groups, about how we pull the data together for financing. And that's why I was brought into the Strategic Innovation Group, because we saw more and more where we were going with innovation was around data, information, and flow. And we have the clinical scientists who design the studies, clinical operations who execute on those. Safety is a big one, making sure our products are safe. And our strategic innovation, which is, I'll come on to that, which our remit is how can we accelerate or revolutionize the development model. And then we have medical affairs, which sort of bridges the gap between ourselves and commercial. And so, as I said, our mission statement is accelerate the transformation of drug development. How is it going to look differently in the future? And a lot of that is around how we're going to use data. And for those who don't know about the drug development process, so this is what we cover in our process. When the compound is ready to go into humans, we do the first in humans, all the way to the regulatory submission when we get the drug approved. So that's the bit of the data bit that I'm involved in, and not the research bit in the labs. Just a little bit about our group. We think the current model is unsustainable. A lot about technology and new entrants to the market, which I'll touch on. So we provide a service which looks at technology, which is one of my main roles, is looks at the information technology, how we accelerate that, embed that in the business, and then how we make that transition to the business by building in the capabilities. And this is our model, which is for personalised healthcare. So this is you would call it our strategy, I suppose, at a high level, which is we want to, as a company, access meaningful data. So it's the diagnostic data, the clinical trial data, and the real-world data. And from that, create really meaningful insights from advanced analytics and integrated data. So you'll notice, and I think it's good to point out this, that we own quite a fair share of foundation medicine, which is looks at the omics and produces that, and is going to produce the standard platform, hopefully, so that every patient has that overall gene description. Roche, which produces the diagnostics and the drug, and then Flatiron is a company that basically they've gone to all the oncology community hospitals, and said to them they had, each of the community hospitals didn't really have good electronic health record systems. They said, we'll put a good electronic health record system in your place, and we'll give you reports as you want, as long as we can then resell and repurpose the data. So we bought a lot of them, and now we've got access to the oncology data, which Roche is really a big oncology company. So that's our strategy, really, about getting hold of the data, the insights, and then realizing the value from both the smarter R&D, so we quickly turn around the information flow in the company. So a lot of big pharma suffers from the fact that it can't turn the data from research and the clinical development trials and push it back in. And that cycle, you'd be surprised that although an industry that says it's got data standards actually couldn't put, for the big phase programs, couldn't put all their data together, even though we have a standard. And I think it's called a standard, but it's a standard approach to standards. But so we're trying to fix that. I think all the other big pharma are trying to. And then we're saying, how do we improve access and personal patient care? So proving access with the diagnostics model and patient care about providing them services. So that gives you context where I'm driving from and coming from and how we look at the problem. So what I try to do when we're talking internally to our group is say, why is this important? Why are we changing things so rapidly? And so this is probably an old quote that you've seen. If you went to bed last night as an industrial company, you're going to wake up in the morning as a software and analytics company. That's with the chairman of GE. And if you think about how your life has changed, and all of these industries have been totally disrupted by information flow. From the Kodaks to the Blockbusters, music, taxis, everything has been disrupted. So why do we think pharma's not going to be disrupted and everything else has been disrupted? There's a lot that, just to give a bit of background, pharma is a very conservative industry and feels it's protected by the regulators and about going forward. Now that may change with the regulators a little bit with the new administration coming in. It was changing at a pace. We don't know how that's going to be affected with the new administration. But what is more important is what's happening around healthcare that I don't think the pharma industry has really woken up to yet. And I'll come on to that, what I think is happening and why we should be waking up and looking at that. So we talk about data, and I talk about technology in the same way because it's really, technology is a way to get hold of data. So these were some of the predictions that we came from Gartner in 2017. So one was augmented reality shopping by 2020 will be worth $100 million. Why is that important? How can we use augmented reality with patients in treating patients, educating patients? It'll become a tool there that we can do that and collect information of them. Browsing by voice is important with the second one, which is 20% of brands will abandon apps. Let's go to why they abandon apps. They've found that some of the leading brands, if they put an app on the phone and then you don't use it, you get a bad brand image. So they're removing apps off the phones if that isn't the way to access customers. So that's one reason we shouldn't be using apps. Then browsing by voice is going to be the future as we interact more. So as an industry, we're struggling about how do we interact, how do we put apps out there on the phone or collect information on the phone. But we're seeing voice as the main medium. One of the little side projects I've got is how we can use, say, an Amazon Alexa in the home to be a patient assistant, to advise them on when they should be taking medication, what they should be training, and can we get the data from the Amazon Alexa, which isn't easy, because they don't give you the actual data, I found out. Algorithms, I think this is just basically data scientists are going to be there in the roles as we go forward. There's lots of data scientists coming into companies. I was just saying to Greg that I hear Novartis have basically put the challenge out to some of the people in the management there, saying if we gave you 1,000 data scientists, how would that disrupt the business? Also by 2022, blockchain business will be worth 10 billion. I'll come on to why that's important, because blockchain, whether it's blockchain or something about security, could revolutionise the data business within the pharma and healthcare. And then you've got to really partner with one of the big 7 who are moving about with data. We're doing a number of projects where we're talking to at least 2 of these 7 about how do we access data, how do we access patients. What I felt was another interesting bit was, although Internet of Things is going to increase, the flow of data is going to increase, data center storage isn't going to increase. So there's an assumption there that a lot of this is just going to be sort of just in the moment data. So how we actually manage that, and particularly in healthcare, how we manage that, because it's not just in the moment. And then another interesting bit, which I think is a signal of how we're going to disrupt the industry, is welfare health trackers. The employers are starting to do, the insurance companies are starting to give trackers. So putting more responsibility onto the individual about how they manage their healthcare, which is a different paradigm switch. We're finding that the tech giants with expertise in big data are starting to come into our industry. The big one, of course, is Google with Novartis, looking at the contact lens that measures glucose. But the others are, I'm waiting for Amazon to enter, or to obviously enter the market. Apple are there with the Apple Research Kit. Some of the other big companies are looking at that. And where they're targeting is on the periphery of what we're doing. So Google's doing a lot around imaging. If you've looked about what they're doing there, they've got a lot of, they're quite controversial. They got the data in the UK from the Moorfield Hospital, and then they started to use more of that data than they should have done, which brought them back to actually how they were going to secure data and prove they only used the data they wanted. But the point is that Google are getting to know images better than we do. So what they're doing is retinal images, but they're also looking at any sort of scans, X-ray scans. So what was once our expertise about knowing how our compounds worked in a certain way, Google and others are starting to, and other small startups, there's another company in Australia called Zebra who's really good, getting good at looking at images. And it's all because the data is available that it's starting to take away what was traditionally an easy, well-protected turf for pharma. New sources, that's the other point. New sources of data creating value everywhere, and I'll come on to where those data sources are. But that, it's the Internet of Things that's collecting data. It's going to help with, one, giving us better insights about patients. Two, getting the patient being able to interact with us more in a patient way. And a big thing in the pharma industry at the moment is, which I think is a strange phrase, but getting better patient engagement. How do we get better closer to the patient? Which basically is saying at the moment what we're, as a pharma company, as an industry, we're selling to the physicians or to the providers or to the payers. In the future, that may shift, that we're actually interacting or giving the patient the decision of what drugs they should be on. So that gives, and the other thing about new sources of data will help us in new ways of doing clinical research. So one of the big things in a lot of companies I've worked for, we've looked at diseases such as schizophrenia or any sort of depression sort of disease. And if you look at across the industry, we've really failed to get many drugs approved in there because the endpoint isn't really crisp. But now it's collecting data, more social data, more about people moving about and interactions. I think we can prove these drugs actually do work, which before we couldn't actually prove that. So it's, we had scales that were meant to rate depression. There's a lot of problems. So, for example, with rating depression, if the interviewer has a bias, can put a bias on how you're interviewed in depression, if you use something like Alexa to ask those questions anonymously, you'd remove that interviewer bias so you get cleaner data.
That gives us an idea for interviewing prospective MBA students. We can now start doing that through Alexa.
Yeah. It removes a bias. Then there's new entrants to drug development. So there's gaming. So for autism, we're actually using games to help autistic children. There's other companies coming in like Grail, looking at the biopsies here. As I mentioned, Google, there's IBM, Watson Healthcare. They're all taking a slice of what was once our knowledge as pharma. IBM is making a big input into healthcare, getting hold of as much data as possible and using its Watson analytics before that. At the moment, it's a little bit on the wane, but I think that's just about the initial hype about Watson. I think Watson will provide a lot of value as we go forward. And then there's the other one. This is the interesting one, which I think is an indication of some of the disruption we're going to get because of availability of data. It's an app for diabetes. And if the diabetic patient follows that app and uses that app, they no longer have to use the low-dose metformin, so the first level drug for diabetes. There's an indication there that if people pay more attention to their healthcare, helped by using apps and tools, you might be doing preventative medicine more than intervention, which then sort of affects the overall market about how you treat diseases. Where we see that this is all going, we see the emergent technologies rapidly changing the way we access patients and do treatment. We see patients, because patients can start talking to each other on social media, making patient community, they're starting to have a voice about what's working for them and what's not working for them. That wasn't there in the past, although there was, I think, across the industry, some attempt to include the patient. Now the patients have a real voice. They talk to the regulators as well as ourselves because they're communicating with data. The FDA, as I said, I don't know about the new administration, the previous administration were making real strides on opening up data, making sure that we have availability, and I'll come on to open data. So we expect this to take off rapidly and to change rapidly. And what do I mean by that? So, if you tell somebody in my company or any company in pharma a year or two ago that you could enroll 7 patients into a clinical trial one day, they would say it was impossible until it's done with Apple Research Kit, that you can actually now, they did it, they got 7,000 patients, so you can access patients quicker. You could find predictive biomarkers for response with published clinical trial data, so you can find new insights from data that's already published. And this was done down in UCSF under a tool, but he got his students to look at available data and found a biomarker, a predictive biomarker on one of our compounds, which we hadn't actually spent the time to go through all that data. And then there's another one, a new diagnostic test for breast cancer from public data. This was a high school student who found a way to do that. So not only are we, the point here is not only are we starting to find the ways that our drugs are working and the way we can do it, but others can access that data now. And then sort of from the FDA and others, New England Journal of Medicine, this was a couple of weeks ago, I think, was saying about what can we do with open data, and open data should be there. Data should be shared both in healthcare providers and in the pharma industry. And not only did they put a paper positioning that, but they also put a challenge out there for what we could do with the data. And you'll see that we look at prediction, sort of decision support tools that can go out there from data that's out there. So what it's pointing to is that as a pharma company, what in the past we told people how the drug could be used and where it could be used and what is the best area, now other people are looking at the data and giving alternative views on that. So what does that mean? What does that position as pharma? What are they providing? Are they providing just a molecule for others to explore its usage, or do they actually get into this game of being the information knowledge experts? And then we are moving towards open data, and I think it's a tentative step in that, because data is an asset, really, for all of pharma. So there's this little tension that's going on. So in the UK, for in Europe, for any study that's completed, it's got to be published into a repository. It's not very accessible because for anybody to access that data, they've got to have a good clinical research reason to access that data. And that's got to be reviewed. And by access, it means it's on a secure server. They run the analysis on it, and they can just take the results away. So they can't actually pull all the data for a clinical trial. But there are other, the British Medical Journal, there's a Global Open Trials, Yale, and the FDA all provide data. It's starting to happen. And from the data that we see available already, people are starting to get diagnostic. I can see this happening more. And so this is where I come to what the data ecology and where it's going to change dramatically, pulling all these threads together. So the research platform is really what we're doing today, which is doing clinical trials, good standard research. But now we start to see patient-generated data. Patients like me, they're starting to collect data longitudinally. And then we see the diagnostic data, the omics data that's connecting with the clinical data, so you can get more personalized medicine. And then at the Internet of Things, we get more sensors, more understanding what the patient's doing outside. A clinical trial was only collecting a particular at each visit. Now with the Internet of Things, essentially you're collecting the entire time the patient's in a trial. We're seeing new entrants. So as I mentioned, Google, but Walgreens are taking a big place, are putting clinics into their practices, which is interesting. If you talk to majority of patients, who do they trust more, their physician or the pharmacist? Surprisingly, it's the pharmacist. So there's an entrance there for patients, and then you could capture the patient. Capturing the patient there, there's you've got some monetary value about how you work with pharma to do clinical trials. Then you've got the patients using tools to make decisions, and then at the centre of it, you've got the electronic health record. Now, in the past, the electronic health record has really just been a payment system between the providers and the insurers. But it's starting to become a decision-making tool, taking data from all these sources and making recommendations. And we're seeing that, you have guidelines and pathways for each disease. They're starting to automate those guidelines and pathways, and then starting to take more data that's openly available. So there's a company in Germany called Molecular Health who've got their clinical decision support tool approved by the regulators. And what they're doing is taking all available open data and literature, and a patient comes in, puts the details in, with the physician puts it in, and it comes out with a recommendation of the top 5 drugs. What's interesting, we haven't provided, or not many pharma are providing data to that tool. So we don't really know how that tool really works, whether adding our data would help or would hinder the way it actually makes diagnosis. But what it means is that in the past, we produced a lot of outcome studies showing the value of that. But now they're using the decision tool that's taking that away from us in that perspective. Who would you agree with more? Data that's based on let's take, for example, UCSF, which accounts for all the California academic hospitals there. That's 16 million patients. Would you be more reassured on those 16 million patients, or on the probably 5,000 or 6,000 patients that we put in a clinical trial? I think there has to be an argument made for that. So I think the clinical decision support tool is going to be a big factor as we go forward on this. And where we see it at the moment is another thing. I'm not sure you may. I wasn't aware until I joined the pharma industry. When you get a drug approved, you get a label which says how it's used, and that's it. Then we monitor safety, and as long as there's not a serious adverse event or that it's causing death or it's got to be used slightly different, that label doesn't change. And if there's an event, we'll get a black box label, but the majority of drugs out there don't change. Yeah. So one of our drugs, Tamiflu, which is used for influenza, the trial's done it with roughly about 12,000 patients. The number of patients exposed, and this was about 4 years ago, 96 million. Yet the label's not updated, and that's just an example of what's happening across the pharma. So we believe we're going to start taking account of that data and become a more personalised label as your data is generated over time. So what do we see as opportunities for new data paradigms? I think the first one is data sharing and collaboration. So at the moment, what we're doing is our own trials, which is a bit ludicrous. We compare our trial against a competitor product, and they may do another trial against our product. We're using more patients, exposing more patients to drugs than necessary. It's probably not viable. If you look at pharma industry as well, and this is why another reason I think it's going to change. The current model is unsustainable for a profitable model by about 2020, depending which analyst you look at. But we really just reach a break-even point by 2020 as an industry. So I think there's got to be more collaboration and sharing of data. Clinical decision tools, as I mentioned, are really going to take the forefront. It changes the role of physician, changes the role of who really puts the input into the clinical decision tools, what goes into there, what data, whether it's genomics data, clinical data. Is it other data that's relevant as well? Is your insurer, is that relevant as a clinical decision tool? Is your social economic status? We're starting to find out all these factors which affect healthcare. And then another one, which is the total patient journey view, which is there's various ways of academic institutions looking at it. But basically, if you've got one illness and your profile, your genetics show it, you will have a patient journey for whether you're keeping health or not at the health. Now, if we can start to work out those journeys, then it may be you want to say, well, what's the best therapeutic molecule to put your patient on? And maybe we say, well, actually, it's because you know the next event is going to be 6 months down the line, you might not use some of the more expensive drugs. I don't know that question, but I do think there's a danger there, a danger for pharma, but in the well-being of the patient is the patient, once you know what a patient journey or trajectory is and how you can change that trajectory, may change how you treat. But whereas a lot of pharma companies at the moment, what we do is we treat the disease, whether it's oncology, whether it's multiple sclerosis. We don't really treat the total patient. If we start to understand the patient journey and the total patient, which in the past we couldn't understand that total patient, but now with the availability of data we can, that's going to change the way we're going to treat patients in the future. New data sources and new insights, I think I've come to that about genomics, sensors, wearables. Longitudinal data is something that we don't get a lot of as well. So when you go into a clinical trial, it's when you've got the disease, and then we monitor how we can cure that disease. We don't really have that much insight on that progression to you getting the disease. If we can get hold of the patient record from start to finish, we can start really looking at that. In the past, we haven't been able to get that because we haven't had electronic data systems, and patients still move about from insurer to insurer. So we don't get that data at the moment. I think there's an opportunity for the use of tools like blockchain to really put a patient data in their record. Now, that's where I think there's going to be a big disruption, because a lot of people, whether it's the pharma company or whether it's some of the insurers or the providers, when they talk about the patient data, they talk about it as though they own the patient data, which in fact the patient owns their data. But at the moment, there's not a place for a patient to really have their data or get their data. I think a tool like blockchain would enable a patient to own all their data, health data and maybe other data as well, and then keep it there with the whoever wants it they can control the access to that data, whether it's a different healthcare provider, whether it's a pharma company, or whether it's somebody who wants to resell the data, but it'd be more a broker market that a patient goes to. And I think that's going to be one of the big disruptors for that, the patient understanding they have choices about who they share their data with. Also, I think it changes research, because I believe that if a patient has a certain disease, they don't just want to share their data with academic institute 1 or pharma company A. They want to share it with as many to make sure that cure of the disease or the molecules are developed fastest to cure them. So I think it changes the way we do research.
So just to follow up on this research question. So if I understand you correctly, the process of clinical trials will be affected because, number one, you'll be able to have much larger sample sizes, and number two, because you'll have the ability to determine subsets within that larger population that may be affected differently by those drugs. And the latter, you could continue to learn that long after the clinical trial phase, which would help you then to go back and either provide more precise advice to patients on what they should be doing, and also maybe provide you with ideas about further drug development research and so forth. So if both of those are true, doesn't there have to be some kind of overall research design? So typical data science relies on natural heterogeneity in the population, right? Yeah. And so we say, oh, there's all these different types of people, and we know, oh, these are the type of people who buy our product. So if we really want to know, like, if there are different ways of administering this drug that are going to have differential impact, don't we have to have kind of, say, doctors administering them in different ways or administering different combinations, or have some kind of RCT that's structured? Or can we allow for just the natural heterogeneity in the population to somehow offer us insight?
So there's different. I think this is an industry we're starting to scan that. So a couple of things on that. What we're doing as an industry, we still think the randomized clinical trial is going to stay for a while, but then you supplement that with pragmatic clinical trials. So you actually put the trial in the clinical setting. So what do I mean by that? The most extreme case is in clinical trial studies, you exclude a lot of patients because you're trying to prove the efficacy of the drug, and you don't want it confounded by somebody who's got diabetes when you're studying, when you're studying oncology. For years, HIV patients were excluded from oncology trials, but HIV patients were quite a lot of people who got cancer. So that's why we supplement a pragmatic trial. There is something that we discussed as an industry with the FDA was thinking.
So you're saying if the sample size was large enough, then you could just control for all of those different variables, like they've got diabetes. And so then if it were effective on just the people who didn't have diabetes, and it was ineffective on the people with diabetes, that wouldn't jeopardize the approval of the drug, because you could demonstrate, that it was effective within a subset of the population. So would the FDA have to change the way in which they do the approvals to make it more consistent with this more sophisticated approach?
So what we suggested, and we had a rep from the FDA there, was changing the model a bit. So rather than the traditional research we do of phase 1, start to do systems biology, which is understand. So instead of doing a phase 1 trial is about 50 patients and you do about 4 of those, and then you do phase 2. Why not take 50 to 100 patients and do deep analytics on those 50 patients? We're basically saying whether that patient's in control or out of control. So you understand, one, the dynamics of it's working in about 100 patients. You understand that it's not highly toxic, and you might have to do some toxicity studies if you start to see a trend there. And you'd understand it had some proof of efficacy. Then the idea was then you would have like a gate 1, where you would actually put the product commercially out there to tier 1 centres, the leading academic centres that had the right infrastructure. You would monitor that in pragmatic trials, or just trial would be too strong a word, but monitor the outcomes of that, and then keep rolling that out. You would do, you're flipping the model on the head and saying, if you start to see tendencies either from an efficacy point of view that's unexpected or safety, then you would do a randomized clinical trial to understand what was happening, whether it was a subpopulation or whether it was something else going on. So that switching it is really getting the product, proving it's safe and efficacious, but maybe not totally finding out how efficacious it is, and putting the shared risk onto a provider or an insurer and the pharma company, and doing these gated release of a trial. I mean, that's where you think it's going to go. Because in essence, that's what some of the big academic centres are doing in changing the way clinical practice is doing. They're doing those real trials at the moment. So that's the way I believe it's going to go in the future. But it's there's a lot of... and the other bit, when you talk about machine learning versus what we do in clinical research, we're doing inference. Machine learning is about prediction. We have to have a debate about whether we're happy with that. I think it's better because we're using more data. We're actually understanding how the drug works in the real world, rather than just understanding the drug works. I liken it to what happened with Volkswagen. They did the perfect scenario for their cars, but when the cars were on the road, you didn't get the return that you were expecting. And I think that's true for a lot of patients. They don't get what they're expecting for efficacy. We don't, as an industry, which surprises me. As an industry, we monitor safety, but as an industry, we don't continually monitor efficacy, which is really surprising to me. I did a study years ago in a disease called esophageal varices, and we found that the way that Spain practiced it, the treatment of the disease, to the way the UK did, meant that it wasn't really effective in the UK. It was just as effective as a placebo, but nobody had measured that. But they were still prescribing this drug. So that's where I see we're going with outcomes. I think if we don't do it as pharma, I think the payers will start revealing that performance. So we've got to get together on this. What else was there? So I think the challenges we have, and I think I've touched on it, willingness to share data. So we have a lot of that between different institutes. So some of the, not only between pharma, but some of the leading institutes, particularly in oncology, they want to be the first to show that their technique or practice is better for patients, to get the papers out. So there's not as sharing data as quickly as they could. And then patient data is big business. You've got IMS, Truven, MarketScan. They're all selling and reselling the data, and this is big money for them. I think that will wash out over time because we are really focusing on patients and stuff like that. I think there is more collaboration because of what I mentioned as an industry, we have to collaborate more. So that one I'm not as concerned about. The other one is data standards and quality. I think we have to change our perception about data. Clinical data is totally different than any other data I've played with, whether it's finance data or other. It's very dynamic. Because you're doing clinical research and patients aren't predictable, the data is stored differently as we continue research going forward. So it's hard to do retrospective fits on data and pull all that together. So that's something we have to look at. We have our own pharma industry standard for clinical data called CDIS, which I said had this problem. Healthcare are producing their own standard. We have to come together about that. And then another one is about patient confidentiality. Can we really, as research goes forward, we use more genomics, and gene SNPs. Can a patient identity really be kept confidential? I don't think it can. Or if it can, you're not going to be able to further research in healthcare as much as you should be able to. So there's that dynamic and big debate that has to be had. The big paradigm shifts I see is open data. I see that coming, and why I see that coming, if it doesn't come from us pushing it as industries and healthcare, is if we have these clinical decision support tools. I think in a fortunate instant may happen that you'll have a clinical decision support tool in one big institution and another tool in another for the same disease, and same algorithm working more or less the same, and yet because they're not sharing the data, one comes out with a poor prediction. And then people will say, well, if you had all that data together, you would have come out with the same predictions on using your machine algorithms. That's where I think it'll come as a push if it doesn't come before that. I think we're talking about more move from inference to prediction. I'm not sure everybody's caught on to that yet. Understanding everybody's talking about AI, machine learning. They haven't really talked about what's fundamentally different, that we're moving from like classical statistics to more mathematical-based problems, and that has got to be something that's been unpicked in the future. And as I mentioned, the system biology approach is going to be a different way of we do a model. And then besides that, my last thought was, how will millennials view health change in the paradigm? So this is just more of the same about being more preventative medicine and how that's going to change in the future. The millennials are really different. I don't know, millennials or the way that we view our minds are being rewired because of all the different tech we've been using. But there's a different approach to healthcare. Also, I mean, I started to look at this because I found out that there was a different approach to gambling. So Las Vegas profits the last 2 years has gone down, and that's because millennials aren't gambling as much as traditionally. That piqued my interest. I wonder if it's about healthcare. So to me, there's other factors as well as technology and data that we should consider as well as new. So that's taking you through the journey of where we are today.
So I think the patient healthcare records is an important one, and it's interesting to hear that Roche is involved in this business, giving hospitals basically free data keeping, data storage, and data filing services in exchange for the data. So what can healthcare companies actually do with this data in a way that is proprietary and makes them money? Because if you're talking about open data and everybody's sharing all the data, then how do you gain a proprietary advantage?
I think it's about making that data, to use all that data to give a personal service to the individual for their personal circumstances. So I look at it a little bit as you have a financial advisor, you will have a health advisor in the future who says, the insurance company, and if you want to do this, you know your patient trajectory, these are the best things for you to do. And that, if you get diagnosed with a particular disease, that you couldn't have picked up in your gene. This is the way you've got to do it. So that's the way I see it, as one of the ways you can monitorize it. It's a health broker.
So, I've heard about how companies like Kaiser Permanente, right? They have their own proprietary personal healthcare record system, and so they're able to get into that database and figure out what kinds of interventions, preventative interventions, result in lower remedial costs downstream, and so then they can do the cost benefit and figure out what kind of preventative interventions they should be investing in. Okay, that makes sense because you've got integration between the folks that are, essentially insurers and those that are healthcare providers. But if that all becomes completely open and everybody can tap into that information, it seems like it would be more difficult for companies to generate a return on their investment in this information.
Yeah, I think it is, but and this is where does business win, or do you take the higher ethical ground on here? In that, the more data there is that we're understanding patient health, the better we can serve the patient. When you say what Kaiser Permanente is doing, having their example of any other insurer, is they're looking at reducing costs. Now, how you typify reducing costs, is that just getting the patient out the door and that they're at home? Is that a lower cost, a burden? Are they looking at the total patient cost over a journey? And insurers, my understanding, I'm not an expert on the insurance, with insurance companies in the US, they're not really looking at the total patient journey, it's just while they're in the system. But if you started to understand you as an individual, your burden of cost in the future, then I think that will change the dynamic. And there's I think, and I haven't thought long about it, I think there's different monetary models there. As you think about paying a mortgage, I think if you start thinking about that, you're paying forward for your healthcare in the future. To me, it's not sustainable. In the Western Hemisphere, the healthcare budget isn't going to increase across the Western Hemisphere. Yet, we have an aging population. So then I believe that the burden is going to be put on the patient, really, to start making the decisions, because the insurers can't make decisions. The pharma companies still have to remain profitable to keep the research. So then I think it becomes a decision of the patient what options are got, and that's where I really believe the clinical decision tool will help them. They'll say, these are your options. You have to decide on that. But I think it's a fascinating area because there's a cultural bit that takes into account on this. I was talking to somebody from MIT Media Lab. It's about your definition of being ill. Being ill to us, if we look at it, we're ill if you're monitoring your blood pressure or your weight or whatever, and you're taking tablets. That's being ill. In some other countries, being ill is when you have to go to the doctor. That's being ill. So if you think about it as a global market, there's opportunity to change things there as well.
Question? Anybody here in healthcare?
No. So I'm convinced that this market is up for total disruption.
So maybe you can answer the question. What if you had 1,000 data scientists at your disposal at Roche? How would that change the business?
I think it's two bits. There's one bit where I haven't touched on, which is I'd use 500 of those to do the deep research, do the molecular research. We haven't really got, as an industry, that there's a lot of molecules that have been put on the shelf that we ruled out because they had an adverse reaction on the stomach, but they could be repurposed for something else. So I'd use 500 of them to repurpose some of our products or to deeply understand. And then I'd put into find out how what's the most effective clinical decision model tool, and become, if not the provider of that clinical decision models, a decision support to understand what is the best data to provide to those models so that it puts our products in the best way that they can be used, so people really understand how they use it.
And so your title is intriguing because it's the digital Or is that what is it again?
Well, it was digital strategy leader. So what we were trying to do was convince our organisation that we had to have a digital strategy, because most of within the product development arm, so within the commercial arm, they understand what digital is from really a media and commercial perspective. But from a perspective of product development, we haven't really engaged in that much in how do you use sensors better? How do you use your information for better insight on the patient? We haven't really taken that out. There's a reason for that, and I think it's a reason that goes across all big pharma, is when you get engaged with the FDA, big companies who do submissions year on, expect or are used to your format of a report going through them, and you can get accelerated reviews. They understand what the data looks like, understand what you're getting at. If you suddenly put in there that you change your endpoint from between a known quality of life scale to using sensor data, that may delay your submission by maybe a few days or a week, which on the bottom line is millions. So there's a conservatism. So why would we want to do that? Well, let's put that until the commercial end.
I used to work for one of your competitors, and you mentioned a lot of tech companies. Are there any traditional peers that you feel are on the same page, or are they pushing another direction where they see this?
I think most of it are chasing the same thing of getting value out of the big data, and most of which is bringing the data in and creating their own castles of data, which I don't think is tenable long term. But that's where we're all chasing this, using machine learning, looking at our data assets internally and trying to buy the different areas of data up.
In that vein, across the whole healthcare ecosystem, are there any particular players that are averse or reluctant or going to be the major impediment? Like obviously FDA as an example, there may be a roadblock, but or hospital that's progressive on data. Like are there sort of impediments downstream that you anticipate or getting the whole industry sort of to that a more data savvy level?
Well, I think what I'm saying is farmers quite rightly more cautious are doing this, because the reason all the regulations are in place, the reasons why we're doing clinical trial go back to some bad disasters with releasing drugs early. So there's a nervousness quite correctly there. But then on the other side of it, I see the leading academic institutes really pushing forward on this. So they're the advocate, and I think we're as an industry probably going to wake up and say, we've got to follow that design at the moment. So I think it's moving. We're just understandably more conservative and nervous about it than the big providers like the Mayo Clinic, the VA, and people like that.
If you're convinced that the industry is going to be disrupted, are you then personally looking to who is going to disrupt it and maybe thinking of making the move to one of those companies? Or do you believe that legacy players like Roche, Novartis, etc., can actually survive and come out on top?
I think some of the legacy players will survive and come out on top. Whether it'll be a couple of the big players. I mean, Roche is well positioned because it has that diversity. I'd say Pfizer's well positioned because they've got a massive treasure chest. The others, I'm not as convinced on whether they've got the right models in place at the moment. But yeah, if I saw an opportunity external, I think if I saw that, but I think it's still we don't know which horse is going to win on this one yet. I'm convinced that there's a perfect storm coming. There's change. I don't know where that change is going to come at the moment.
One of the biggest pieces of missing data when you're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of pharma is compliance. So there's been a whole bunch of different tools that have come about in the last couple of years to kind of track compliance, like connected pill boxes and even connected pills, right? Are you guys sort of working in that area, in that space? Do you track compliance in your clinical trials now, using sensors, using connected pills?
We've not gone to connected pills yet. I think that's an interesting one. I mean, one submission got pushed back on the connected pill from another company. I think it's interesting. What I'm more interested in is the research behind that behaviour. Because if you've got a connected pill but they don't take the connected pill, well, have you found anything out that you didn't already know? I think it's more about can we change behaviours? And that's where the apps are interesting. The diabetic app is interesting. Are there ways that we can use technology to change behaviour in the house? So that's why I'm looking at like the Amazon Alexa. I think you can have sensors in the house that can change things and alert people. There's in the morning, there's a company called Wise Mirror that will do your diagnostic on you in the morning. I think in helping the patients understand where they are would be better than focusing. It's more the behaviour you want to do rather than try and force them to behave. I think that doesn't really work. But we're looking at it, from the connected pill to an app that, I've seen one app that, the company called AI Cure, where you actually, when they're in a clinical trial, they actually video someone, make sure, and actually sophisticated that they know that the pill has been swallowed. You can do blood tests afterwards and stuff like that. But to me, that problem, and there's a guy in my group who's a psychiatrist who's looking at it more. Is there something we can do about behaviour? And that's where I'm fascinated, coming back to the millennials. What's changed about behaviour? What's changed their behaviour about gambling? Or is it? So to me, it's about, is it risk behaviour has been changed? And if it is, then we can come to compliance. So that's the fascinating bit of research, I think.
All right, great. Thank you, Francis.